This is part 3 of our Chapter 2 video series where we're going to be covering the tax credit for child and dependent care expenses. Even though you see the word expenses here, this is not a deduction, but it's a tax credit. Let's take a look at our 1040 form where we've already calculated out the tax liability for the whole year reported in this line 12A. Now we're going to be reducing this tax by credits. This credit here in line 13A, child tax credit or credit for other dependents, we'll cover that in another video. But let's take a look at other non-refundable credits that are first reported on a schedule number 3. So here on schedule number 3, we had briefly mentioned this line number 1 credit called foreign tax credit, that it's not too common, but a more common one now we're covering here in line number 2 is called the credit for child and dependent care expenses that are calculated on form 2441. So let's take a look at that form. The purpose of this child and dependent care expense credit is to give taxpayers a break for them to go to work. Maybe our taxpayer has a dependent child. We call that a qualifying child, usually under age 13, or other dependents that are typically maybe mentally or physically incapable of taking care of themselves. So we need someone to take care of them so our taxpayer can go to work. Most times, these dependents are already reported back here on the 1040 form under the dependent section. But again, if you're looking at a child, older children can take care of themselves when the taxpayer goes to work. But the child that's under 13 or any of the dependents here that cannot take care of themselves because of some incapacity, now maybe we can pay someone to have them taken care of, and we now can go to work. So here in part 1, we're going to identify the person or company that's providing the care. So you write in the name here, their address, their ID number, and the amount that were paid for the year. You could even pay relatives by keeping in mind that the amount that you pay them is going to be taxable income to them. Relatives that don't qualify would be any other dependent being claimed by our taxpayer. The name of the taxpayer would go up here. Or any child of the taxpayer under age 19, I believe, would not qualify as a person that you can put down here in part 1. So here's 2 rows. If you have more people you pay during the year, you can make an attachment to this form. Now in part 2, you have to identify the people that are being taken care of. Typically, again, that's the qualifying child under age 13 or other dependents that cannot take care of themselves. So you write in their name, their ID number, and the amount that you paid for that person. Again, the amount you write up here is the amount you paid the provider, the care provider. And here in part 2, the amount you paid for each dependent. Now the maximum amount you can put here in part 2 is $3,000 per person. And the maximum you can claim for the whole year is for 2 people. That means a maximum of $6,000 for the whole year. Yeah, that's 2 for $6,000. Okay. So the next limitation is based upon how much income that was earned by our taxpayer. If you see the word earned here, that means work income from your job, wages, salaries, even business income. And if the taxpayer is married, you generally have to file a joint return. So now you have to also enter the spouse's earned income. And of all of these dollar amounts we've entered, you generally pick the smallest amount. Again, the amount you paid the provider, the care provider. the amount you paid for each dependent up to a maximum of $6,000 for a total of 2 or more dependents, the amount being earned by our taxpayer, and the amount being earned by our spouse. And you pick of all of these the smallest amount. Now, if your spouse doesn't work but goes to school, or maybe your spouse is a dependent because, incapable of taking care of him or herself. Remember, spouses cannot be claimed as dependents, yeah, but if they need to be taken care of, or if the spouse is going to school, you're not going to put down zero over here, but you can have some make-believe income just for purposes of calculating out the credit. That make-believe amount is $250 per month when our spouse is a full-time student, or if the spouse is disabled and cannot take care of themselves. So again, you look at the amount paid to the providers, you look at the amount paid for each person up to $3,000 per person, a maximum of $6,000. You look at the amount earned by our taxpayer, you look at the amount earned by our spouse, including this imputed amount here per month. And again, you pick the smallest amount and enter it here in line number 6. Now, this is not the credit. We're going to have to reduce it by a percentage. That percentage is on this table here in line 8. So what we do in line 7 is go back to our 1040 form and look at the dollar amount in this line 8B. So if you remember back here on the 1040 form, we calculated all the way down to the taxable income amount. But above that, line 8B was an important amount, and you can tell amounts are important because they're bolded, is the AGI, adjusted gross income. Yeah, this amount right here. So we recopy this line 8B back here on the 2441 form. Then we're going to multiply it and look up this AGI amount down these two columns. You notice as you go down the column getting higher income, the percentage in this column gets smaller and smaller all the way down to a minimum of 20%. So you rewrite the amount here in line 8 and you multiply it by the AGI to get the tentative credit that you're going to write here in line number 9. The credit is tentative because remember now, this is a non-refundable credit. The credit you can claim cannot be bigger than the tax you owe for the year. So basically that tax you owe for the year is reported here in line 10, reduced by any previous credits like that foreign tax credit we talked about earlier. So you look at the tentative child and dependent care credit, look at your tentative tax, and you pick the smaller so the tax liability doesn't go below zero. So this is the amount here of your credit that again you report now back on the schedule number 3 here in line number 2, and you subtotal it here with the other non-refundable credits, and then that goes back to the 1040 form in line 13B, and you subtract it out from the tax up here. Okay, a lot of detail, and we'll see it makes it simpler if we use tax software later on in the semester. Continue into the next video where we're going to take a look at the calculation of the next tax credit here in line 3 on schedule 3 called the education credit or credits.